and spends a lot of time looking at trends across the states. Jocelyn, what can you tell us about the state landscape on curriculum data? What type of data are states collecting, and what should we expect when we start looking at a state?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Great to be with everyone today. So, as Josh was mentioning, the Collaborative for Student Success hosts the Curriculum HQ platform. And a key feature of the platform is our 50-state map with DC soon to be added. So, look out for that. And that's our collection of publicly available information on state supports for high quality curriculum. So, you'll see here that our map covers 4 categories. We have curriculum resources, things like a state definition or lists of state approved or recommended materials. We have a category for adoption guidance and tools, things like rubrics and other types of guidance. We have one on professional learning, so that includes supports for curriculum aligned teacher training. And finally, and the topic of our conversation today, curriculum data. So this category is our newest one. And when we started doing this work, gosh, almost 4 years ago, there wasn't much to report here in terms of state data on local curriculum usage. So it has really grown, and we're so excited to be joined by our partners here to dive into that. Now, about half of the states are sharing some form of data, and I will emphasize here that our map is more art than science. So we look to give states credit for lack of better terms, for their efforts to collect and share information on curriculum adoption and implementation. And you'll also see here that more than half of the states represented here in the half of the states are part of the CCSSO IMPD network, and they're featured in research projects like the ones you'll hear about from our friends at RAND in just a little bit. So let's dig in a little bit more about the types of data that is being collected by states. As you'll see here, while we give that partial credit to nearly half of states for sharing some type of information, only a small handful have comprehensive data available. So using resources from groups like the National Council on Teacher Quality, we've identified 6 states with statewide information on district curriculum choices, and 3 that have this for ELA, math, and science. And that means you can look up any district in the state and see what they've chosen. You'll also see our note here that other states are working on this, and so more to come. And in addition to the comprehensive statewide information, we've pulled several other examples of state data around curriculum. So going in the order you see here on the yellow on the left, statewide usage reports, those show aggregate data. So we can tell, for example, something like the overall percentage of districts using a program that the state deems as high quality, but not the specific programs chosen by each district. Satisfaction surveys show how the state's teachers feel about their materials, their professional learning, and things of that nature. With all the attention in state action around literacy and the science of reading, we also now see several states requiring districts to submit a literacy plan that usually includes their chosen curriculum. So it's possible to click on each plan and look for the district's curriculum if you were trying to get a statewide look, but obviously that's quite time consuming. Then we have something we're calling one-time studies, where a couple of states have done investigations on curriculum quality and shared a report. And finally, we found a couple states with optional surveys that get into district material selection, though those are not always up to date. And I will turn it back over to you, Josh.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a little bit of an understanding of like how this is playing out across the nation. Laura, I would love to call you into the conversation. I know you all at CEMD, the Center for Education Marketplace Dynamics, are looking at lots of state movement and the specific ways that states are capturing and using this data. Why is it important? What's kind of the case making? What's the reason that these states are collecting this data? And how is it different than what like the typical data we picture of, which is usually like curriculum efficacy, how well curriculum actually works? What's the difference there, and what should we be looking at when we see states looking at this data?
Fantastic. Josh, thank you so much. And Jocelyn, thank you so much for kind of like kicking it off and teeing it up. I really love the way that you illustrated that, several years ago, there was a gap in state data, let alone district level data. And so if you're not familiar with CEMD, our organization, we really leaned into that information gap. And we said, without a reliable signal of the district selected materials, it's really hard as a system, as an ecosystem, as a state, as a regional center to target the types of supports and services that districts need in order to execute on behalf of their students most successfully. So Josh, you go ahead and pop to the next slide. that's really a little bit about CEMD's origin story. But today, fast forward from that initial problem statement, we're a central hub for the collection and the distribution of insights that are really related to curriculum instruction. So nationally, we collect from publicly available data about school districts, the core math, science, social studies, and ELA, supplemental math and ELA and assessment. And we pilot different initiatives each year to say, can we collect this data? Can we collect it at scale? Can we collect it in a way that doesn't disrupt the everyday work of a district leader? Last year, I'm proud to say that we researched over 2,900 districts. We're shooting for 5,000 this year in order to really get a comprehensive view, because when we're able to have that data in hand, we can start to ask and answer different questions. So Josh, when we think about that, right, like why is it necessary? Why does it matter if we understand at the system level what materials and services are happening inside school districts? They have local control. They're really strong at supporting their students. And when I think about this question, I think about GPS, right? So if you all think for a second, when was the last time that you drove somewhere new, right, without a GPS? I don't know about you, I'm pretty good with directions, but even in those situations, like I might not have taken the most efficient route. I might have gotten caught in traffic along the way. I might have taken a wrong turn. And at some point, I would have said to myself, where am I? Right? You probably eventually got where you needed to go, but you might have been late and you might have been frustrated. It took you longer than you wanted. And so when I think about state leaders who are trying to impact student outcomes across their state, using curriculum instruction, that's one lever to success. And so that's why that curriculum data is so valuable, because it provides the context and the guidance needed to maximize their trip, so to speak. And so if you take this example, go back one more for me, Josh. If you take this example here on the screen, right, do districts select a consistent math curriculum across K-12? You might at the surface say like, it doesn't really matter. But actually, if you think about it, how does it knowing the answer to that question, it's only 4% of the time. How does that allow a state system, a regional service center, even local service providers, the ability to think about like, well, what is the support that is needed here to talk coherently about vertical coherence across grades, to increase math language access in a consistent and reliable way for students? That's one example of how access to curriculum selection data can actually be powerful and a powerful tool for measurement and support. So now if we pop to the next slide, Josh, I think when I think about that service to states, right, with better data and information, SCAs really, they've got better visibility into those statewide trends so they can more strategically kind of collaborate and with and support their LEAs. At that macro view, the selection data helps state teams, especially state teams who might operate because of organizational setup, right, in their own silos. It gives them a common foundation on which they can build their strategy, they can direct their resources. And so if you think about all of those states who have instituted science of reading policies, some of those states, they're able to prioritize the tracking of material selection. And so that allows them a clear map for measuring progress, monitoring successes, and reflecting on the initiatives so they can continue to be fine-tuned across time in order to better support students. And so if you flip that and you say, well, what about districts? When states, you're kind, go back to the 3 columns for me, Josh. When districts, for districts, when states hold and they share that data, the districts can also receive more targeted services, right? Targeted services from regional service centers. District leaders, I just delivered a report to a district leader recently. He reached out to me last week. He said, hey, can you help me understand across my region in my state, what other materials have district leaders selected? I'm looking to talk to other leaders. And sometimes, you know, I can think about the district that I live in. My superintendent, he can call the superintendent next door. It's not very far, a couple miles. But in some systems, right, maybe you'd want to know actually what someone's doing across the state. Maybe that's a district who's common to yours. And so understanding how districts can also leverage that data is really an important part of that state strategy too. And Josh, I think you pointed out that question though about efficacy data. And I think I'll be the first one to say that's not what this is. This is selection data. And even selection data, as much as I love it and am passionate about it, it's not even the same as how much is that material getting used, which is a whole different question. But I think when I think about that like value chain of the data and the information, if you will, right? Selection data, it's one step in understanding that student instructional experience. When I think about efficacy data, 100%, that is our end goal for us to say, we know what materials, in what context, under what conditions, with what supports drive student outcomes. But the fact is, as a system, we just don't have that yet. And so as we work together across organizations, across state teams, all of those data pieces and putting them in that chain is critical that we can reach that goal together. So if I kind of wrap up, I'd love to highlight two states. As Jocelyn mentioned, there are several states who are working either in specific domains or even more broadly to think about the way that they measure curriculum selection. We've had the privilege of working with two states that I'd love to highlight today. So Massachusetts, for example, my team was really proud to work with the Massachusetts DESE team on their new curriculum dashboard. And I think what is really important to me out of the Massachusetts story is that it is a process. It's not a like flick of the light switch situation. It's a process over time, and you can be proud of where you are in each step of the journey. So when I talked to leaders from Massachusetts, they shared, they started with ad hoc surveys. They started with heat maps that they felt weren't reliable, but over time, along with their users, they built a really user-centered dashboard that features data now from over 96% of their districts. And so the DESE team, they thought really thoughtfully about designing a tool that was actually for use. And so it's designed in a way that district leaders can log in, they can view their own data, they can fix inaccuracies in real time, they can explore the data from other districts, understand what materials other districts are using, how those materials are rated according to the quality framework that Massachusetts holds. And so that really helps leaders locally make informed decisions and fosters regional collaboration. And all of that then is on behalf of that state initiative. Over time, that state team is hoping to use longitudinal data to understand trends and impact over time. So I think Massachusetts is a fantastic state to highlight in that way. The second state that I would highlight that we've had the ability to work with is New Mexico, right? In New Mexico's situation, they had gathered their own data on instructional materials in use across the state. They had viewed it and thought about it critically internally, but they really wanted to take that next step in making those insights available and usable across the state team and across the public. And so when I think about these two examples, what I would really want to underscore, right? It's not about a dashboard. It is not about a fancy tool that people can use. It's really about that the state has a focused effort. They are putting intention behind wanting to understand the reach of those materials as one input into instructional change. And they really are being reflective on how that data is supportive, not only to their own team, but to districts and to community members. And they're taking really thoughtful steps to gather it and to communicate effectively about that. And so when I think then about that sort of like foundational thinking, it's really the ability to reflect on, what's next. So for some, like as I mentioned, Massachusetts, they're looking forward to longitudinal data. Others are really starting to get under implementation. What can we say about the curriculum-based professional learning, the dosage, and the implementation that's occurring alongside these high-quality materials? Yet others are trying to pull finance information closer to that data so they understand spending and allocation. And so states have the opportunity to take all of this different fragmented data, think creatively about the ways that that information is gathered across teams and putting it really together in thoughtful ways so that those threads can be woven together and really create greater action and insights on behalf of students and districts. Josh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. I mean, I so appreciate that kind of breakdown of the different types of data at use and that we should be collecting and looking at. As a former high school math teacher, it really, to me, just kind of sounds like being able to describe the whole picture and all the moving parts of curriculum and how instruction is driven, how improvements in instruction are driven, how school and system leaders are able to connect across districts and states. There's a lot there of kind of making the big picture work. So really, really appreciate that. In that spirit and on that, a similar vein, maybe even to a greater detail, we have wonderful research from the American Instructional Resources Survey, which is led up by our wonderful friends here at RAND. So C. Doan, Ashley Wu would love to invite both of you to join the conversation, share more about the type of information you collect from states using the AIR survey, and the way that you think that data can be put into action to help both system improvements, but also help these leaders ask the right questions. Would love to hear about the work that you're leading on that front.
That sounds great, Josh. And thanks for that introduction. If you want to skip to the next slide. And so I think it's really great how we kind of sequence this. And then Jocelyn and Laura talking about the work of Curriculum HQ and CEMD. And it really kind of segues really nicely into kind of how all these pieces fit together to kind of better understand what's going on with curriculum use. And so a lot of what Jocelyn talked about for Curriculum HQ is like what's going on to the state level in terms of policy. Laura and CEMD is talking about what are actual district selections like and how we like to think about what the AIRS or the American Instructional Resources Survey can provide is it's a little window into the classroom. And so you have these state policies, you have districts selecting their materials. What are teachers actually doing with those materials? What do they think about them? What kinds of supports are they getting in terms of what their principals are saying about these materials? What kinds of PD are they getting? Those are the types of things that we measure within the AIRS. And so you can see there's kind of four topics on the side there that Ashley are going to talk about, but it kind of just highlights some of the things we've learned about instructional material use and showcase a little bit about what we captured within the survey. So you can go one more, Josh. And so before getting into the fun stuff, which is the the actual findings, we'll talk a little bit about the boring stuff. Where the AIRS comes from is that at RAND we have an awesome resource, which is the American Educator Panels. And so these are standing panels of teachers. So there's roughly 25,000 teachers that are part of the American Teacher Panel, the American School Leader Panel. I think there's about 8,000 principals in there, and then the American School District Leader Panel. And these are standing panels of educators that have agreed to regularly take surveys that are kind of written by RAND researchers as well as researchers outside of RAND. And so just a little bit about what makes the educator panels unique. These are randomly selected participants. And so we hear all the time about sort of like convenient samples and response biases and surveys. And so we get around a little bit of that by randomly selecting participants into the survey. Participants are paid honorariums based on survey length. And so, as you can see, the AIRS is very, very detailed because a 20-minute survey. And so, I don't know if you've ever taken a 20-minute survey before, but it's very, very long. And so, we really appreciate people's time and kind of candor and answering about their instructional materials. And so, they're compensated based off survey length. And then respondents get several online surveys per year. And then, a nice thing about this, too, is that the AIRS has been running annually since 2019. And so you're able to kind of see how responses kind of grow and shift over time. You want to go to the next slide, Josh? Thanks. And so a little bit more about what is specifically within the AIRS. And so at a very high level, what the survey is based off is what ELA, math, and science instructional materials are used in schools, how and why materials are used, and what factors support their use. And so each of these surveys is a national sample of K-12 public school teachers. And so the most recent round of the survey had, I think, about 8,600 respondents. And so you get nationally representative estimates as well as state representative estimates. And so Jocelyn mentioned before, I'll work with CCSSO. We have state representative samples for the states that are participating in the CCSSO's IMPD network, as well as for California, Florida, and New York. And so a lot of the data we're presenting here, I mentioned that this is a survey we've been running from 2019. And so a lot of the data we're going to show here, though, are new data that we have from our most recent survey, which was fielded in 2025. And then just a little bit more in terms of specifics, what are the different topics? And so we ask about what specific curriculum materials the teachers use. And so we present teachers with a big long list and we say, which are the things that you use? Did they modify or supplement these materials? And so, as we know, teachers do not often use these materials kind of by the book. They often modify and supplement things. And so we ask about what types of modifications take place. we have a lot of items about teacher professional learning. And so what types of curriculum-based professional learning are they getting? Is the curriculum-based professional learning actually curriculum-based? And what do teachers think about how effective their professional learning is? And then we also ask about these kind of other supporting factors, including what do prep programs say about how teachers should be using materials? Do teachers engage in standards aligned instructional practices? So we ask a little bit about what the actual instruction is happening in the classroom. And then we ask a number of questions about what is the school leader's role in the use of curriculum materials? Does your school leader incorporate curriculum materials into observations? Do they understand your curriculum materials? Just to kind of get a better sense of what's going on within that schooling environment and how does it support or not support, in many cases, the use of instructional materials. And so what do we do with this? We write reports, of course. There's lots of reports that we publish across the years on different topics from the airs. But if you want to go one more slide, Josh. Another great opportunity for this too is that there's lots of opportunities for you to explore the data on your own. And so what we featured here is Bento. And so this is a dashboard where we upload the AIRS survey every single year. And so you can kind of use it and use the sort of dashboard interface to take a look at all the survey items that we have on there, and as well as being able to segment it across different subgroups. And so if you want to compare across subject area, grade level, it gives you the opportunity to do that. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Ashley to talk a little bit more about some of the specific data and findings that we've kind of uncovered over the years.
Thanks, Steve. And so first, I'll talk a little bit about how we can use AIRS to really dig into what specific materials teachers are actually using. So on the AIRS, as Steve already kind of alluded to earlier, we provide teachers with a long list of curriculum materials. And we define these as materials that are meant to constitute a full comprehensive course of study. And we ask them to select the materials that they use at least once a week on average. And we ask this for each grade band and subject combination. So that's like elementary, middle school, and high school ELA, and then again for math, and then again for science. And this really helps us to understand what in practice teachers are using in their classrooms. And so here we show on the left-hand yellow side, an illustrative example of what this looks like for ELA across grade bands, drawing on our data collected in spring 2025. And in addition to asking about curriculum materials, we also ask teachers about supplemental materials or any other additional materials that they use beyond their curriculum materials. And so you can see on the right-hand side in blue, we also show as an example the top 10 supplemental materials used by ELA teachers. And we show here the data for ELA, but we also have this kind of analogous data for math and for science. And because we ask teachers about the specific titles they use, we're also able to gain insight into how teachers mix and match different materials. And so here we show 3 examples of how teachers paired some of the most commonly used curriculum materials, which actually were often self or district created materials, with different supplemental materials. And so here, one thing that we've also used AIRS for over the past couple of years is to help states in CCSSO's IMPD, or Instructional Material and Professional Development Network, understand the extent to which teachers are using high quality materials, or HQAM. And of course, we know states might define HQAM differently, but we use the EdReports green ratings as a way to have a common benchmark across states. And to figure out whether teachers are using high quality materials, we use those EdReports ratings and merge them in with the curriculum list that I showed earlier. And I'll note that these are all states where we have teacher oversamples, allowing us to produce state representative estimates. And because we have administered AIRS for so many years, we're able to look at how the prevalence of using HQIM has changed over time. And so here we show the percentage of teachers using an EdReports green rated math material at least once a week or more from 2019 to 2025 for the various IMPD states, as well as for the nation. And so figures like these really can help states see how much progress they've made in supporting the uptake of HQIM. And here we show the analogous data for ELA materials where we similarly see substantial increases over time in the use of HQIM. And so next, I'll present some of what we've learned about how teachers are combining and adapting their instructional materials in practice. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we can show how many teachers using the AIRS data are using which curriculum materials, what else they're using it with. And we can also show and categorize these materials based on the type of material, like whether or not it's considered high quality. But we can also use our data to understand how many materials teachers are using. And so on average, teachers reported using 2 curriculum materials, with about 2/3 of teachers combining multiple curriculum materials. And as you can see here, ELA teachers and secondary teachers seem especially likely to combine multiple curriculum materials. And we can also do something similar when looking at teachers' use of supplemental materials, where we find that on average, teachers reported using 5 supplemental materials, with about 75% of teachers reporting using multiple supplemental materials. And we can also look at these things together. So for instance, we can look at how teachers' use of curriculum materials relates to their use of supplemental materials. And here we show that we found that the more curriculum materials teachers reported using, the more supplemental materials they also reported using. And altogether, this is kind of like a first step in understanding how teachers are using many materials to support their instruction, which we hypothesize could have some consequences for the instructional coherence that students experience. And so to try to get a better handle on teachers' use of multiple materials, we asked teachers who use more than one material why they decided to do so. And teachers were able to say that they use different materials for different classes, that they use different materials for different groups of kids within the same class, and that they use different materials for all of the kids in their same class, which, as you can see here, was by far the most common response. And we also asked teachers to explain in an open-ended question how they were combining different materials. And they often pointed to the fact that they used their different materials to provide supplemental materials, or that they were combining multiple materials to support differentiation and also small group work. And so we've used these different types of responses, like how many materials teachers use, including others like how much instructional time they spent on them, whether or not they modified them, to create 4 different profiles of curriculum use. So for instance, there is that by the book teacher who just uses one material with very little modification. So in other words, this teacher that we kind of imagine is probably using their material with the greatest degree of fidelity. There's also that modifier teacher who uses one material but then modifies it quite a bit. The DIY teacher who mostly uses self-created materials, or a cobbler teacher who puts together multiple materials. And what you can see here is that most teachers, about half, are cobbler teachers, as shown as the purple bars, and only about 20% of teachers are by the book teachers, as shown in those darker yellow bars, although math and elementary teachers are more likely than their counterparts to be by the book teachers. And also, interestingly, teachers using standards aligned materials, or again, those EdReports green rated materials, were even more likely to be cobblers, which we think might be because they could be combining different materials together, given the likely rigor of those materials. And last, one thing that we're also able to capture through AIRS is teachers' perceptions of their materials and their teaching experiences. And so we'll show 2 different examples here. And the first example is that we ask teachers whether or not they feel like their materials are too challenging for most of their students. And not only can we explore these perceptions by subgroups like teachers' subject and grade level, as shown here, but we can also connect teachers' perceptions of their materials to their instructional practices, like, for instance, how intensely they use their materials. And we can also explore factors that might explain their perceptions of the level of challenge of their materials, like their professional learning experiences and how long they've been using their materials. And the second example that I'll show here is from a report that we recently published on teachers' experiences teaching multilingual learners. And so we asked teachers how prepared they felt to teach multilingual learners, and we explored these perceptions by teachers' subject and grade level, but also other potential explanatory factors like whether or not they held a bilingual credential, the composition of their student body, and also the type of instructional material that they used. And as you can see here, only about half of teachers said that they felt moderately or fully prepared to teach MLLs, but this varied a lot by the various factors that I named earlier. All right, with that, I'll pass it back to you, Josh.
Excellent. Thank you so much, C and Ashley. Sharing some of their contact information if you want to jot down their emails. If you have a question around the air survey or for C or Ashley, please drop it in the Q&A function below, and they can either try to answer it real quickly in text or in the chat, or we'll hopefully take a moment or two here towards the end to answer some Q&As that we get. But now that we have this kind of understanding of the different levels of data that we can collect and the understanding that it brings to our implementation, our adoption, our selection, our usage of high quality instructional materials, I'd love to bring it into a state context. And today we have Jeff Smink, who is the executive director of the Education Trust New York. And Jeff, would love to hear about how you and your team rely on this type of data. What kind of advocacy actions are driven by, having access to these kinds of data, and where do you see room for improvement on actually having access and being able to use and put these into action? Turn it over to you. Jeff, would love to hear about your experience in New York.
Great. Well, thanks, Josh. Good to be here with all of you. And so I think New York is in many ways, an example of maybe what not to do when it comes to curriculum data and transparency. And so there's a lot of room for improvement. But I'll just if you can go to the next slide, I just want to set the context for New York for those who are not familiar with our state, because I think the curriculum data piece falls in this larger context. First of all, we are first in funding by a large margin. Our student outcomes are nowhere near where they need to be. And I always just use this one slide. If you can go to that next slide really quick, Josh, just to give you a sense of what that looks like. Looking at fourth grade NAEP reading scores, if you look on that last column, you can see what we spend, and then you can see what other states that get better outcomes are spending per student. That's just kind of the context for the work that we're doing here in New York. And you can go back to the next or the first slide. And so I think, within that context, we're just seeing a lack of transparency and urgency. And that affects, our work as advocates, but more importantly, parents and students, in the sense that given those investments that we're making, we're not getting the outcomes that we need. And I think it's beyond fair that the public have access to, how those funds are being spent. And curriculum and professional learning is a big part of that funding, right? And so that's really driving, a lot of our work is that, parents, taxpayers, policymakers need to have a better understanding of how those funds are being spent. And if they're not spent on evidence-based practice, that's a problem. And so I underlined this last bullet. I think most states consider themselves local control, but New York really, really does, and really, digs into that as often an excuse as to why they can't hold districts accountable for things like transparency. So you can skip over to the next. Yep, perfect. So just to give a sense of the curriculum landscape in New York, we've done a lot of work on literacy over the last 3 years. And what we tried to do back in 2023, we did a landscape report on the state of early literacy in New York and wanted to find out what curriculum are districts using. And of course, the state did not collect that information. We had to do an individual FOIL to every single district in the state. We have 700 districts in our state, which is insane. We heard back from about a third of our districts and found that the highest, or the curriculum that was being used the most, was Lucy Calkins Teacher College, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So out of that report, we were able to get some action from our governor and the legislature. They passed a law in 2024 that was called Back to Basics. Within that law, there was a requirement that districts had to provide an attestation that they're aligned with us, that their curriculum and instructional resources were aligned with the science of reading. Remember, I said we're a local control state. So this was a voluntary, or they had to sign it, but there's no accountability behind this. Nothing that will happen in districts if they're not aligned, and really no way to check that they are aligned. So districts just submitted this info in September. As of now, the state is not planning to make that public. We have another FOIL request in to make sure that that information is being made public. And we're also being told by the state that there's 100% compliance with alignment with the science of reading. We know for a fact that's not true. We know count at least 10 districts that we know are still using balanced literacy resources. So that's where we are right now in New York. And we are going to do a lot around holding districts and the state accountable, right? Again, going back to all those funds being spent, I think we have the right to know whether or not it's being spent, on programs that are going to give our kids a better chance to read or do math. The one bright spot in New York is we have an initiative called New York City Reads, which is run by our New York City Public Schools. And as some of you may know, district schools have to choose between 3 approved curricula in literacy that the district chose, and we're starting to see some really strong results from that. So we do have a great example there. On math is a newer issue for us, one that we're just starting to kind of lean into. The state did just release briefs on sort of what districts should do and look for when it comes to math curriculum, but we're already seeing a lot of pushback around, what is an evidence-based curriculum, evidence-based approach to math instruction. And so this is just starting, but we're also thinking through how do we collect information, on what districts are doing. But as many of you know, it doesn't seem to be as much of a knowledge base as there is, in literacy around, what's evidence-based and what's not. Once again, we have a bright spot in New York City where they are using illustrative mathematics across right now all middle schools, but eventually across the district. That's earlier than New York City Reads, but again, an example that districts can do this. But again, I think most districts would love some state leadership and state support. And we'll be releasing a landscape report on the state of math next spring, similar to what we did in literacy. And we're hoping that's going to launch a conversation, around why this is so important. So you can go to the next slide. So just as far as next steps, what we're doing and seeing here in New York State, sort of challenges and opportunities. On the positive side, our state is working on developing a statewide longitudinal data system. Or I think we're one of like 3 states that does not have one. So that I think will help and sort of give some impetus to start sharing more curriculum information. I think a big problem is we have this, and again, it goes back to the local control, but just a lack of urgency around everything in education in New York. But I think our legislature's goal is, as long as they increase funding every year, that's all they need to do. It doesn't really matter how districts spend it. That's up to them. That's a problem, right? So we need to have more of a monitoring mechanism around how those funds are being spent. Again, I think just the capacity to monitor high quality instructional materials. Right now, we're doing it. It seems like the state should be doing that. We're doing it with limited capacity, limited funding. And then I think there's just confusion, across the state and probably beyond New York, just around, what's the connection between both adopting high quality instructional materials? We know that's not enough. And then how does professional learning fit in there? And, what does that cost and how do we monitor that? So I think there's just a lot of stuff going on right now. We got to figure out how do we make that more clear. As advocates, we're pushing a number of things this year that I think get at curriculum and public transparency. We want to do universal reading screening. We're one of 9 states that does not do that. We want to do more on professional learning and coaching, and ideally, have some parameters around, again, what is evidence-based and what's high quality on that. And then finally, again, really need to hammer on this public transparency and accountability piece. We're asking, if the states share that information on reading. We have some asks around funding transparency as well. And so again, I think it's just continuing to build the drumbeat around we're spending all this money, we're not getting the results. We need more transparency, more accountability, because at the end of the day, right, it's our students that we want to make sure that our students are getting high quality instruction that's going to give them the best chance to have the foundational math and reading skills that they need. And we're not doing that right now. And one piece of the puzzle, I think, is getting a better sense of, again, how are districts teaching and what are they using to teach. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate hearing kind of how this is playing out in New York, what this data would mean to you all as advocates in the state, and ultimately kind of the role of advocacy and applying some of that pressure to call for this transparent data that helps schools and districts make good decisions. We thank you so much for bringing that New York perspective. We also wanted to lift up just a couple of other examples of what this can look like in other states and the way in particular that advocacy communities are engaging with calls for improved curriculum data. So we opened this up with a conversation with Jocelyn. I'd love to bring you back in, Jocelyn, to talk about these 3 state examples in the advocacy community.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly more, but just to round it out just a little bit. So California has actually recently just made math news for updating its list of state reviewed math materials. But here we're highlighting the good work of the California Reading Coalition in filling a gap when it comes to sharing data. So this coalition has published a report with information on the curricula used by more than 300 of the largest districts, in addition to hosting a reading summit and a whole host of other activities to help push for quality materials. Moving over to Ohio, we have 2 organizations here, both Ohio Excels and the Fordham Institute are very strong advocates for quality curriculum. These groups have elevated the need for state-approved lists, coaches, and many other instructional supports. And just one other example, and we've already talked about New Mexico today. New Mexico Kids Can created a literacy action center that was parent and family focused. And the point of that was to help parents and families learn more about their local district's materials and advocate for quality. And the organization actually created its own sort of crowdsourced curriculum map prior to the state stepping in and now being one of only 3 that maintains its own map at the district level for ELA, math, and science. So it really shows the importance of advocacy in moving this work along.
Thanks, Jocelyn, for those examples. I know that's super helpful to have a couple of references across the states to draw from. I want to thank everybody for just sharing so much useful and relevant information. We have a few minutes here at the end of this call that I want to use to answer a couple of Q&A questions that have been submitted. Before we turn to those, though, I have, selfishly going to claim the first kind of question to pose at you all, which Jeff spoke directly to kind of that, the hesitancy around local control or the use of local control as sometimes the reason why states feel like they might have difficulty wading into these waters or collecting these types of data. I was wondering if any of the panelists might just talk to whether that frustration around local control or that relationship with local control exists in other states. And does it prevent this good work on curriculum from being collected, being seen, being shared? Don't know if anybody has a point of view on kind of local control in this discussion, but wanted to throw it out there.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm sure others will too. I agree. I don't know a state that wouldn't say it's not local control, from Texas to Rhode Island to, you name your spectrum. And that makes sense, right? The closer you are to the students, to the teachers, the closer you want to be to your materials and your decisions. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I sat on a local school board. Curriculum was one of the, biggest things that we did. I think what we have found in our work is that states and districts and advocates can be really creative and really clever here. And so, yes, some states are going to have prescriptive laws and a much, more explicit state point of view, and others are going to lean on guidance and incentives and communities of practice. But there's no scenario where the state can't come in and give supports and scaffolds and help and have a point of view that can make this work easier on the local level.
Laura, you came off mute. Do you anything to add there? Totally okay.
Yeah, states know their communities best. I will say, in the work that we've done with states, I've been surprised at the receptiveness by district leaders, because there's value there for them. the ease in seeing curated state lists, the ease in seeing what districts are asking for. Having come from like a curriculum side myself, districts often asked, can you please show me a district like mine who's bought this material? Like that is a really common question. And tools like this by the state make it very easy to answer it independent of a publisher or a provider. So in work that we're doing currently with the state, the districts themselves, district leaders were so excited to receive such a tool and to make a connection across the state. So that opportunity for collaboration is really strong.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and something I can add to some of the survey work that we've done is that often when we talk to states within sort of like the IMPD network, and so sometimes Rhode Island is looked at as an example of a state with really strong legislation around the use of curriculum. But even within our data, it's not 100% of Rhode Island teachers that report regularly using an HQIM, despite the fact that they have really strong legislation there, kind of requiring districts to adopt it. And so I don't want to undersell the fact that like legislation can be a very strong tool there, but to get teachers to regularly use it and to intensively use it, there are a lot of other things that need to sort of happen beyond things that happen at the state level to encourage that high level of use within classrooms.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Just looking at the Q&A function right now, we had a wealth of questions around the AIRS survey. Ashley, looks like you answered most of those, but didn't know if there was any that you wanted to kind of voice over for audience benefit. If you'd like, you can also, for attendees, you can look at the Q&A function to see Ashley's resources and answers there to those questions. We also have a question asking, based upon the insightful data from the curriculum use profiles, would love to hear a few panelists' insights regarding applying these insights to designing the next wave of high-quality instructional materials. Yeah, that's a great thought. Do any of you have thoughts on kind of using the curriculum use profiles of teachers into maybe understanding where curriculum can go from here?
Yeah, maybe I can start there. And I think this kind of ties into one of the questions that I just responded to in the Q&A. I think what we found is some of these kind of contextual supports around curriculum use are really important for teachers to feel like they are kind of like wanting to use that material with fidelity. And so I think in some ways, like there are the aspects of the curriculum themselves, but also like how are principals supporting and encouraging teachers to use those materials in the classroom, I think are also really important.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much for those thoughtful questions. I definitely saw lots of interest in the AIR survey, so we'll be sure to include links and access to that when we have a follow-up to the webinar. I just want to thank everybody for joining, panelists and guests. We really appreciate your insights and your engagement and questions. This was recorded, so we will be following up here shortly with a recording of the webinar. And please look out for or bookmark and check out Curriculum HQ because we will have a bit of a roundup of the webinar resources from all of the teams and a little bit of write-up in case folks weren't able to join or would like to share it with their colleagues and network. Thank you all for joining. We really appreciate it, and we hope to continue the conversation soon.